Good afternoon. Welcome to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. My name is Buffy. I'm an 18-year criminal defense attorney who has done many jury trials as well as other areas of law, which is why I'm so passionate about survivors' rights. I've represented women who've been survivors of sexual assault as well as survivors of domestic violence. So what you can expect from me is you can expect truth and honesty in a legal analysis, an analysis that is not going to hide behind someone got let off on a technicality, okay? Because that is not a real legal analysis. Additionally, you can expect compassion and respect for the victims or the survivors because they're real people whose lives may have been taken or they may have been victimized as a survivor of a crime. So today we're talking about Frank Sinatra Jr., kidnapping, federal power, and how visibility reshapes justice. When people think about kidnappings, they usually imagine chaos. Something sloppy, something desperate, a crime that unravels quickly. But the kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr. in 1963 challenges that assumption. Because this wasn't chaos, it was leverage. And more importantly, it was a case where the full weight of the justice system engaged immediately, not eventually, immediately. I'm sure the name didn't hurt, right? That difference matters more than we like to admit. Let's talk about setting the scene and then why the timing matters. It's 1963. Imagine that. America is living in an era where the federal government has expanded investigative authority, which may seem like a small feat. However, it gives them more resources, which when you're dealing with, your son being kidnapped, that is definitely a blessing for you. Interstate crime is taken seriously. So it used to be situations where places like New York and larger cities were actually segmented and didn't communicate with each other. So the federal system actually helps that. And then that's when certain crimes became jurisdiction of federal courts versus state courts. Media attention is centralized and powerful. This is decades after the Lindbergh kidnapping, and that case fundamentally reshaped kidnapping law in the United States. By the time Sinatra Jr. was taken, the legal landscape had changed completely, and that matters. Let's talk about the kidnapping. Frank Sinatra Jr. was abducted from a hotel room in Lake Tahoe where he had been performing. The kidnappers restrained him, issued ransom demands, and communicated directly with his family. Importantly, Sinatra Jr. was kept alive and eventually released after ransom was paid. This wasn't accidental. From the start, this was a negotiated crime, one designed to extract money, not to kill or cause a victim to disappear. That distinction is legally significant. The immediate response. This is where systems show their power. The response was swift, and that's not hyperbole. From the moment the kidnapping was confirmed, local law enforcement engaged, federal authorities became involved, communication lines were opened across jurisdictions, and this is where fame changes everything. Not because the law is different, but because priority alignment happens instantly. There is no debate about whether resources should be used, no delay in escalation, no waiting to see if it resolves itself. Speed preserves evidence. Speed saves lives. Federal jurisdiction. By 1963, the Federal Kidnapping Act, often called the Lindbergh Law, was firmly established. The law allows federal authorities to intervene when a victim is transported across state lines or interstate communication is involved. This immediately expands investigative reach, surveillance authority, prosecutorial leverage. Compare that to earlier cases, like Charles Ross, for instance, in the 1930s. The federal authorities did not intervene in that. Additionally, that case was not able to be prosecuted or resolved. I did do some reading on it after I did the podcast a little further in depth about Mr. Ross, and he was not found, I think, until much later. But there was no real resolution to that case because the tools simply didn't exist. And I think now it's like there's a lot of things that exist now that almost have us spoiled, like literally same-day mail. I know when we were talking about the Charles Ross case, we were talking about the ability to kind of kite checks, which is, you literally write a check that you don't have the money in your account and it took so long, and you could that's Frank Abagnale if you've seen Catch Me If You Can. I know I mentioned that previously. But justice isn't just about intent, it's about infrastructure. And to be able to do the high level of justice that a lot of these cases require, you do need a strong infrastructure. You need people who are compassionate about what they're doing. You need people who are knowledgeable about what they're doing. They know about chain of custody. They know about all the things that legally help a case stand on its own and be able to be prosecuted. And the people who committed the crime to be able to be held accountable. Let's talk about ransom communications as evidence. Here's something people don't always realize. Every ransom call, note, or instruction is also evidence. In Sinatra Jr.'s case, communications were documented, voices were identified, and patterns were tracked. Money trails were monitored. That's how cases are built, and how they're built cleanly and as substantial evidence. Essential evidence. Not on notoriety, but on preserved evidence. Fame doesn't create evidence, it creates urgency to protect it. Let's talk about the arrest and the prosecution, where the law finally speaks. The kidnappers were eventually identified, arrested, and prosecuted. And here's where the case becomes instructive. This wasn't mob justice because it was Sinatra Jr.'s son, or Sinatra's son. This wasn't backroom resolution. This was a clean, prosecutable case because evidence was preserved early, jurisdiction was clear, and cooperation was immediate. From a prosecutor's standpoint, this is exactly what you would want. Clear elements, documented communication, identifiable defendants. The case didn't succeed because Sinatra was famous. It succeeded because the system engaged at full capacity from the beginning. Let's talk about the uncomfortable contrast. Now comes the part that sits with us uncomfortably. Most kidnapping victims don't receive immediate federal attention, coordinated jurisdictional response, media pressure to resolve quickly. Not because their lives matter less, but because the system is reactive. Justice responds to visibility, and visibility is not evenly distributed, as we all know. What this case teaches us, let's reflect a little bit. From a legal perspective, this case highlights three truths. Timing matters. Early engagement preserves evidence and options. 2, jurisdiction matters. Federal authority expands what's possible. 3, attention matters, not morally, but operationally. The law works best when it is allowed to work quickly, clearly, and with resources, because without resources, there isn't a lot that can be done. That's not favoritism, that's reality. So in closing, Frank Sinatra Jr. survived the kidnapping, and that's the outcome we want for every victim. But this case still leaves us with a question we shouldn't ignore. Is justice equally accessible, or does it depend on how loudly a case demands attention? The law didn't bend here, it mobilized. And who it mobilizes for and how fast tells us everything about where justice is strongest and where it is most fragile. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope that you will tune in again to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. Thank you very much. It means a lot to me, you tuning in, and if you have some story ideas, feel free to drop them in the community, and I'll check them out because I do interact often with the community. So thanks again, and I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.